Hello and welcome. I'm Ned Scharf, president of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, standing in for our executive director, Beth Hessel, who had a family conflict tonight. But if Beth were here, she would tell you that the Athenaeum is a community of lifelong learners, people who love culture and intellectual pursuits in all their many varieties. And just out of curiosity, how many of you are members? Oh my gosh, well, you've ruined my pitch for membership. But we have many wonderful treats in store for you between now and summer. At the conclusion of the program, I'll tell you about just a couple of upcoming ones, and our brochure for the winter-spring season will be arriving in your mail slots shortly. COVID and related events have disrupted not just our proceedings here at the Athenaeum, but also what had seemed until not too long ago a clear-cut trend, which is the move to repopulation and regentrification and revitalization of older American cities, of which Philadelphia is, of course, a shining example. Our program tonight is all about urban revitalization, especially with regard to the role of immigrants and related issues of social equity. It raises any number of interesting questions to explore. For example, just how does immigration intersect with urban politics and repopulation here in Philadelphia and elsewhere? What are the effects on the countries that our immigrants are leaving? And how essential is the gentrification phenomenon to the whole process of revitalizing our civic society? And one more question: has the revitalization trend now been stopped in its tracks and sent into reverse? And if so, what's the impact on our immigrants? What's happening to them? These are fascinating and pressing questions, and we're very lucky this evening to have two distinguished and terrific scholars to explore them with us. First, Domenic Vitiello, Associate Professor of City Planning and Urban Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and author of the forthcoming book, The Sanctuary City, which is being published by Cornell this summer. Domenic has also published Immigration and Metropolitan Revitalization in Philadelphia and nationwide, which you see here. It's a seminal collection of essays on immigration and urban renewal, and at our program's conclusion, you can buy a copy from the wonderful Carly of Head House Books at the rear of the room. And of course, Domenic, I think, can be persuaded to sign a copy or two. Our second expert guide tonight is A.K. Andrew Sandoval-Strauss, Associate Professor of History at Penn State, specializing in Latino Studies and Urban History. His book, Barrio America: How Latino Immigrants Saved the American City, was published in 2019, and an earlier work, Hotel: An American History, was a Library Journal Best Book of 2017. Andrew also has a new book that's about to come out. All of us who love cities and city living seek a deeper understanding of the dynamics shaping and reshaping our communities. We couldn't ask for two better people to guide us through the seminal issues tonight than Domenic and Andrew. Thank you both, and welcome.
So I'm just seeing that my battery is about to conk out, so we'll see if we can fix that. Is that an outlet over there? Good to start. All right, I'm just going to take this off momentarily. I tested negative for COVID at 3:30 today so that everyone can feel at ease. Thank you all so much for having us in. We're going to run this as my speaking a little bit, and then Domenic will take over, and then after he's done for a while, I will do a brief conclusion so you know how it looks. All right, so let's start with the big picture that has been fleshed out both in his work and in mine, right? I think the titles tell a lot of the story. His co-edited volume with Tom Segru, Immigration and Metropolitan Revitalization, and mine, Barrio America, and the subtitle offering the thesis, How Latino Immigrants Saved the American City. So my book is the story of a remarkable transformation in American urban life in which about 25 million people, some from Latin America, some from Latino areas outside cities, migrated to U.S. cities over the course of about 50 years. And these migrants arrived just at the time when they were needed most, because their migration began at a time when American cities were in deep distress, right? They were losing population, they were shedding jobs, they were facing fiscal emergencies and rising crime. And more broadly, the sense that perhaps the era of the big American city had simply come and gone. Now, if these migrantes, right, had not come, again, remember, so we're talking about 25 million people in U.S. cities by about 2000, 2010 that were not there 50 years earlier. Had these migrantes not come, my thesis is that a lot more American cities would look like places like Detroit, Michigan, Gary, Indiana, and Youngstown, Ohio, parts of which have become familiar to us from books of what's known as ruins photography, and whose abandoned homes, shuttered factories, ghostly office buildings, and empty schools are sort of a metonym for the urban crisis itself. In other words, these immigrants, and those from elsewhere in the world, right? Sort of my focus on Latinos is primarily because I can speak Spanish, but if I could speak Mandarin or Cantonese, if I could speak Korean, Arabic, Yoruba, or Creole, I might have cast a broader net. So about half of the immigrants we're talking about in this entire era are Latinos, about half are from other parts of the world. So they essentially together solve one of the biggest problems of the 20th century, that is the urban crisis itself. Now, there are a lot of examples in cities across the nation of urban decline followed by revitalization, but in my book I use two neighborhoods to give sort of the kind of close-in sense of exactly what it was that happened. Now, one is in Chicago, one is in Dallas. I'm going to give you the very brief capsule description of exactly what happened in both. So if you wanted to pick one neighborhood that really sort of exemplified the fate of the industrial city, the South Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago would be a pretty good choice. This was an old immigrant neighborhood of people from places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Before them, there were Germans after the fire of 1871. They came and found work in factories like International Harvester and Western Electric, and even more importantly, they found affordable housing where they could afford to live. Now, despite these advantages, South Lawndale had been losing population starting about 1920, but it really went into a tailspin populationally after World War II. At the height of the urban crisis, the Chicago writer Stuart Dybek, who had grown up in this part of the city, published a selection of stories called The Coast of Chicago, and he described South Lawndale as follows. It was a place where residents walked past block-length gutted factories, past walls of peeling multicolored doors hammered up around flooded excavation pits, hung out in half-boarded storefronts of groceries that had shut down when they were kids, dusty cans still on the shelves. Now, 900 miles to the south, another community was pressed into service as an example of the urban crisis just a couple of years later. In 1992, Texas Monthly magazine commissioned the journalist Grover Lewis, sort of one of the gonzo generation of journalists who had written for New West and Rolling Stone, to sort of paint a portrait of Oakcliff, the community where he had grown up in the early 1950s. Lewis remembered his street in the early 1950s as he put it, a leafy tunnel running past tidy bungalows and well-kept Victorian mansions. Regarding Jefferson Boulevard, the main commercial drag of the area, he remembered the shopping district had been second only to downtown Dallas in the early 50s and was anchored by stores like Skiller's, Sears, JCPenney, and all the other blue-chip concerns. But when Lewis revisited the area for that feature piece in 1992, after it had lost quite a few of its residents, he wrote a different description. He wrote, "The devastation was total. An entire neighborhood sunk in rot. The surviving houses were vine-choked, boarded up, literally atomizing in a ghastly mockery of the thriving community that I recalled. I groped for terms to encompass the scope of the disaster. Systemic collapse, municipal cancer, de facto apartheid, social time bomb, 1,000 points of dark." So when Lewis looked at Oakcliff, he could only see the classic pathologies of big cities. But in fact, Lewis was seeing Oakcliff in the darkness before dawn. By that time, a huge influx of mostly Mexican and Salvadoran migrants had already set the neighborhood growing again, and in fact, it was growing even faster than Dallas as a whole. By 1990, Oakcliff was home to 53,000 Latinos and also to 11,000 African Americans, so integration of the neighborhood happened simultaneously with Latinization. And thanks to both groups, the neighborhood had enjoyed its first significant population gain since the 1940s. By the year 2000, it was more than 3/4 Latino, 10% Black, and boasted more than 113,000 residents, which was 30% more than at its previous peak in 1950. Along Jefferson Boulevard, pictured here, empty storefronts were being reoccupied. In 1970, for example, the street had had only one identifiable Spanish-language business. But by 2000, it was dominated by bodegas, panaderias, taquerias botánicas, fruterias, quinceañera and bridal shops, travel agencies, and money transfer outlets. So it was no wonder that by the mid-2000s, the city's leading newspaper, the Dallas Morning News, was celebrating Oakcliff as what it called the Latino downtown of Dallas. Now, much the same was happening in South Lawndale back in Chicago. The local population had been stable between 1960 and 1970, but that really concealed the fact that it went from about 2% Hispanic to about 33% Hispanic. So in other words, without these newcomers, this neighborhood would have suffered population loss even faster than Detroit in its worst decade of decline. The neighborhood grew to more than 70,000 people by 1980, over 80,000 by 2000, at which point it was about 83% Latino, 13% African American. 26th Street became the main shopping boulevard for a huge Mexican diaspora of people living all around the Great Lakes region. It's between 1 and 2 million people by best estimate. And in 2001, Crane's Chicago Business found that this corridor was the most economically active one in the entire city, besides the Magnificent Mile along Michigan Avenue, right? Like North Michigan, where all the super shishi stores are. Home values more than doubled between 1990 and 2000. Sociologists began to celebrate Little Village for its community vibrancy and active street life. And this sort of culminated in 2011 when the city's mayor sort of cited Little Village's economic importance to the city and suggested changing its name to Second Magnificent Mile. Now, these kinds of stories of recovery were by no means limited to Oakcliff and Little Village, right? Most of urban America had enjoyed a dramatic turnaround. Violent crime dropped for 25 years straight after about 1991, and big cities like New York, Los Angeles had been or became statistically safer than they had been since the 1950s, and that's when they began keeping reliable statistics. So they may have become about 2014-15 safer than they ever had been ever in their histories. So much so that, right, people moving into cities became, in one sense, its own problem, right? The problems of big cities were no longer abandoned businesses and disappearing populations, but rather the fact that so many people wanted to live in them, that housing costs were driven up, especially for working class families. So if we revisit the classic formulation by the urban historian Ken Jackson, who noted in 1980 that between 1950 and 1980, 18 of the 25 biggest cities had lost population. If you rerun those numbers from 1980 to 2010, you see that 17 of the biggest 25 cities had actually gained population. I should add, of those 25 biggest cities, 2 and nearly 3 are 50% or more Latino. 9 of the 25 are 1/3 or more Latino, and 13 of the 25 are 25% or more Latino. Right? So this is sort of a national phenomenon in which very large proportions of our largest cities have become heavily Latinized. So that's the national scene. Let me turn it over to Domenic to talk a little bit about Philadelphia.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And Andrew could have been describing Philadelphia in much of what he just went through in Dallas, Chicago, and the United States generally, right? I realize I'm talking to an audience that pays more attention to the regular news than the audience I see most of the time in my day job. And so these sorts of things, right? This graph of Philadelphia's population from 1790 to just a few years ago are probably familiar, to you. I want to suggest some of the big narratives we have, right, for describing not just why Philadelphia, declined and then has modestly come back since about 2007, right? Don't just have to do with capital flight, right, and deindustrialization and reinvestment, and I think it'll probably sound familiar to many of you. As I observe, right, the stories that we've been telling about this recent uptick, right, of the last 15 years almost, that Philadelphia has been growing again modestly, started out with, stories about, I assume, right, people like most people in the room, right, empty nesters, returning to the city as their, big old suburban homes, were empty and lonely because their kids left and went to college and, went on with their lives. And then stories about those kids too, right? People in their 20s and 30s. Some of my colleagues who really study demography, call this an extended youth, right? Because if you were 22 in 1950 or 1960, and you weren't yet married and graduated from college and in your first job, and bought your, if you were white suburban house, right? You weren't sort of moving along in life. But today, right, those big life course events, right, are all spread out across people's 20s and 30s and into their 40s, right? And so people have this extended youth, right? And it's the youth and the empty nester, their empty nester parents who've come back to the city, now go to the opera downtown and go to all these, bars and clubs in what some of my colleagues call these sort of youth neighborhoods like Northern Liberties, Fishtown, right? And some people also told stories about real estate investment, about artists, right, making certain neighborhoods cool and the rest of us following them. And those stories, all those stories are true. But arguably the biggest, most important factor in American cities, and Philadelphia's among them, right, revitalization, was largely missing from that narrative for a good many years. Right? And it's immigrants, foreign-born people moving to cities and suburbs, and by their presence, right, repopulating them. Without immigration, Andrew told you some figures from particular years, and people like us, we choose years and places and so on to tell the stories we want with numbers, right? But it's unequivocal that in the 21st century, without immigration, effectively no American metropolitan region's population would be growing. Because A, we have a relatively low birth rate. It's not as low as Europe, but it's low. And B, we're moving to non-metropolitan areas, places like Idaho, right, instead of big cities and their suburbs. And so without immigration, we don't have, or we haven't had in the 21st century, a replacement population. Right? And so it's very much due to immigration, right, in a fundamental sense, that American cities have been growing. I made a sort of back of the envelope calculation 4 or 5 years ago, trying to make sense of Philadelphia, right? Of this modest regrowth that we have. Today we're about 1.6 million residents inside the city of Philadelphia. Again, this is the city, right? Down from probably over 2.1 million in about 1952 when we peaked. Made a little back of the envelope calculation that made a series of assumptions about how many of the immigrants in Philadelphia, recent immigrants, probably aren't in the country, are not in the country with legal status. And I came out with a number that suggested that probably without illegal immigration, or without people who are in the country illegally, right? If Mayor Kenny wanted to and were able to deport them all next week, right, Philadelphia would not have grown, right, or regrown. I was so gratified that Tom Ginsberg, who works for the Pew Philadelphia initiatives, did probably made the same set of assumptions behind those pretty hard to calculate reliably calculations, and came up with the same conclusion shortly thereafter. I want to illustrate a little bit of this regrowth, because I think, as my story about how and why and particularly who has revitalized Philadelphia suggests, right? Revitalization doesn't always look like what we think it does. And I think Andrew's work has illustrated this in many parts of the US in wonderful ways. I'm going to try to do this briefly in Philadelphia. I love to show these tables, but I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of years, because the point of showing you these tables, and this is the Philadelphia city and suburbs on both sides of the Delaware River. The whole point to the first 40 years here, right, between 1950 and 1990, is that all the European numbers go down as older immigrants age and die and aren't replaced by new immigrants from Europe in our era of largely closed borders in the United States. But even beyond our era of closed borders, when we reopened the borders with the Immigration Act of 1965, Philadelphia remains a low immigration region, continues to lose population. The only numbers on this set of tables that grow really dramatically are people from Puerto Rico and African Americans coming largely from the South in the Second Great Migration, right? 1970, it's flipping around in a way I didn't actually expect. But from 1950 to 1990, the groups largely remain from Europe. Their numbers go down. Puerto Rican and black populations in the city and suburbs grow significantly. But Philadelphia remains a place of low opportunity. And so people with choices generally don't choose to move to Philadelphia in this era. By 2000, we start to look like the new Immigrant America. A lot of people talk about this, a lot of scholars like us talk about this as the post-1965 America, right after we reopened our borders and became a much more diverse society. In Philadelphia and so many of the cities that we call the Rust Belt, right, Buffalo to St. Louis and so on, right, this happens much later. It's a post-mid-1990s story that we become a significant immigrant destination, and those numbers of foreign-born, right, start to go up. And by 2010, if we're in the city as well, right, the top 10 immigrant groups include Liberians, Haitians, Cambodians, too. Now this is doing something weird. I actually am not in the part of my presentation I thought. So I think it may have copied twice. I'm going to go down to jump to one different slide for you. Oh, actually, yes, because, all right, and then Andrew, how do I get? Oh, it's that one, right?
To upper left.
You can see where.
Sorry, it's
there it is. Thank you. Super. All right. I want to show you one more, and then I'm going to show you much more interesting things visually, maps, pictures. To me, this is a really important table here, right? It shows you that the most common 10 occupations, most common 10 jobs for immigrants on the left, and the most common 10 jobs for people born in this country, in our region, in Philadelphia and its suburbs. And I think it's A, really important to notice the diversity, and B, to notice something that's like my favorite fancy social science word, which is bifurcation, which means that especially among immigrants, generally in our labor market in the United States and in this region, but especially among immigrants, there are a lot of high-wage jobs that require a lot of higher education, computer software engineer, registered nurse, post-secondary teacher, that's my job, right? Professor, fancy name for it, right? Physician, surgeon, right? And some of those occupations fit the stories that we tell about new immigrants. Because one of the fundamental things to understand about immigration since 1965 in the United States is that it is no longer almost exclusively working class people, as it was 100 and more years ago, right, when my great-grandparents came to the United States. It was overwhelmingly working class communities moving to the United States. Today, since 1965, very bifurcated. People with lots of wealth, with very privileged positions in the labor market, right, come to work, usually through legal channels that we make available to them. And then we have tons and tons of people, millions of people, working as cooks, as home health aides, as maids, housekeepers, janitors, landscaping, and the lower paid, less well-protected sides of the construction industries, all of which sustain the wealth that the rest of us enjoy, those of us who have money to employ those people, right? Fixing up our, remodeling our kitchens, taking care of our children and our elders, working in every sort of medical facility that we have, right? Cleaning up after us, and so on, right? We have this incredibly bifurcated labor market generally in the United States, particularly after manufacturing jobs left and sort of took away much of the middle, if you will. And immigrants slot into that. They don't cause that, but our immigration system and policies reinforce that, particularly as we give legal pathways to people with wealth and what we value as credentials, and we restrict legal pathways much more often for people who end up as cooks, home health aides, maids, janitors, and so on. So let's take a quick tour of Philadelphia, a quick look at Philadelphia, and I show you this mainly because it's at a bigger scale, and partly to make the point that neighborhoods all over the city have been repopulated by immigrants, have been revitalized by immigrants, but they're not all the neighborhoods that all of us inhabit every day, probably. Okay, so I'm going to zoom out, well, actually show you a couple of pictures if I am where I think I am. But let me ask you first, if you had to go out and measure revitalization, and I'm not going to call on a couple of you, but if you had to go out and measure revitalization of your city or your region, what would you measure? Go ahead. Tax base. Okay, what else? Was that a hand? No. You would try to measure the tax base. What else? Construction permits. All right. I like that one. What else? School enrollments. Okay. Anything else you'd measure? That's not a hand back there. No. Anything else? Business startups. All right. I wasn't going to call on you, but you probably figured that out. That's a good one too. 3 out of 4 of those answers had dollar signs on them, right? And one was about repopulation and people's bodies being somewhere. Tom's was not only had dollar signs on it, but it had units, right, of, businesses, new businesses on them. But most of us, when we measure revitalization, put dollar signs on it. None of you said increase in income, but that's really common, right? Or increased property values. In some ways, your construction permits was a good proxy for that. Right, but we tend to measure revitalization in the terms of gentrification, in the terms of places getting wealthier, with dollar signs, growing, if you will. I want to suggest to you that that's absolutely captures reality, but not all of reality, and only a part of revitalization. So these are restaurants in South Philadelphia and Center City. Some may look familiar. They're all undergirded by immigrant labor, some of them created by, and owned by immigrant chefs. One of them owned by someone who doesn't have legal status, but is one of America's most celebrated chefs, South Philly Barbacoa. But I want to suggest to you that this revitalization, right, as gentrification, which we see in Center City and the neighborhoods surrounding it, is just one part of revitalization in Philadelphia, where if we measure it more in terms of occupancy and people re-inhabiting residential, commercial, other types of space in our city, we capture a lot more than the dollar signs can. And they're very important. I would never argue, the health and dollar signs in our tax base matter fundamentally, right? As does our construction industry and business startups and so on, right? This is a former synagogue in South Philadelphia that's now a Buddhist temple. This to me is what revitalization in the row house neighborhoods of Philadelphia, the working class neighborhoods of Philadelphia, especially right here in the lower northeast Philadelphia. This is Castor Avenue, if you know that part of the city. And if you saw my maps, right, that's the part of the city that has become most super diverse. This big circle here, where people from all over the world live. Right, that just in that lower northeast circle, right, people from the Dominican Republic, Vietnam, China, Pakistan, Korea, Mexico, Jamaica, Brazil, Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, China, West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, Trinidad, the Middle East, India, Philippines, and Cambodia. And we can slice that in lots of different ways, but I read through that really just to emphasize how super diverse certain parts of our city have become. And most people who live where I live, which is Mount Airy in Northwest Philadelphia, actually most people in Northwest Philadelphia and downtown and South Philly and West Philly never make it up to the Northeast, right? But if you have blinders on about the Northeast, right, you're missing so much of the action, and super diverse place, right, where huge population has turned over without gentrifying any neighborhoods, right? So this is in many ways what revitalization without substantial gentrification really looks like. And you can find it in Southwest Philly too, right? Especially Woodland Avenue, but Chester Avenue, Baltimore Avenue have become revitalized as largely African and Caribbean. But also, if you really know your last name, right? Dungs is a Southeast Asian name, and they are more diverse than Southwest Philly and other neighborhoods are more diverse than we often recognize, right? That said, I think it's incredibly important in Philadelphia to stress how much immigration and urban revitalization is black-led. Right? We are a really important center of African and Caribbean immigration in the United States. Philadelphia, unlike Dallas, Chicago, and many other places, doesn't have one huge population of Dominicans or Mexicans or Central Americans, right? We are a place of many different, mostly smaller, foreign-born communities, but added up, they make a big share of our city, and added up in certain ways, right? Particularly black immigrants are a huge group. And much of this revitalization is black-led, which is not part of our national narrative about immigration for the most part. I want to zoom out just really quickly to stress that we are talking about metropolitan revitalization and not just working class neighborhoods of Philadelphia and gentrifying affluent neighborhoods of Philadelphia being revitalized and their wealth being supported, right, by immigrants and immigration. But cities and towns across the region, some of them are wealthy, like Lower Merion, others are much more working class, right, like Norristown, Upper Darby, generally inner Delaware County, Pennsauken, East Camden, Bensalem. These are all places being repopulated, revitalized by mostly working class immigrants. Right, here's a zoom into that a bit for you. I don't have a pointer, but you can see a lot of this is in the city, but a lot of the greatest concentrations are in the suburbs. And revitalization looks like this too, right? Not just fancy restaurants, not just if you will, the markers of gentrification. If you haven't been to Upper Darby lately, it's the other hyper-diverse or super-diverse area of our region, along with the Northeast, and shows that, again, just makes the point better than I can showing you a picture, right? The revitalization of Philadelphia and other American cities through immigration is absolutely a metropolitan phenomenon, and one that I think in important ways extends well beyond cities and metropolitan centers. And Andrew's going to add a few more words about his most current work, looking at other parts of Pennsylvania, before we open it up for some questions and discussion.
Yeah, so just relatively speaking in brief, what I want to talk about is the cities in Pennsylvania that are showing, as Domenic mentioned, sort of a since the 1990s, though sometimes it begins a little bit earlier, example of this broader phenomenon of immigrant-led urban and metropolitan revitalization. The fastest growing, as many of you probably already know, the fastest growing Hispanic colonias in the state have been in a line of cities extending about 90 miles southwest from the Lehigh Valley down toward Gettysburg. We're talking about places like Bethlehem, Allentown, Reading, Lancaster, and York, right? After Philadelphia, these are about half of the 10 most populous cities in the state, again, after Philly. These are cities that mostly peaked in population around mid-century, typically a little bit later than 1950, sometimes 1960 or 1970, and then began to decline, in part due to the deindustrialization that really hit the steel and related industries of Pennsylvania very, very hard. They were stabilized starting primarily in the 1990s by Latinos that remigrated from elsewhere. A lot of these folks had lived in New York City especially, and were looking for places with more affordable housing and better schools, especially as gentrification took hold in the city, in New York City itself. So here we're talking about Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, people of Mexican heritage a little bit more recently, joined by significant Colombian and Central American colonias, right? And they count in those 5 cities that I mentioned for between 1/3 and 2/3 of the entire population, right? So sort of often our thinking about those industrial cities can be, especially for people outside Pennsylvania, really very much behind the times, right? These are substantially Latino cities. And I think it's important to emphasize some of these cities because a national narrative took hold after 2016 that when you think about Pennsylvania, immigration, and cities, right, people go straight for Hazleton, right? And when they sort of tell that story and of the Latino migration there and the political response that emerged, they often tend to naturalize it. Like, okay, well, there's some logic to these new people moved in, the folks living there freaked out and launched a nativist political movement. But the fact is that that wasn't some sort of automatic response to a changing economy on a number of levels, right? There's sort of a number of scholars that first said, actually, Hazleton was not in decline. It actually had found sort of new life as a warehousing and meatpacking center. So actually, the economy had begun to recover at the time of this anti-immigrant reaction. Then Domenic in particular said, actually, the other thing you need to do is look at other municipalities in Pennsylvania. There were a few dozen of them that passed the kind of anti-immigrant laws of the sort that became law in Hazleton. But a lot of cities and towns in Pennsylvania did precisely the opposite, right? Some of them opened their arms to immigrants, either through local policy or through active recruitment, so that you have a really interesting patchwork of xenophobia or welcoming that does not have any sort of obvious economic determinant, right? It's not like declining places went anti-immigrant and sort of stable places went pro, or vice versa. As Domenic pointed out, it often was really a voluntary decision of city leaders of, okay, what does this mean for our city, and how are we going to respond? My new project is to think of that in these 5 cities in a sort of political history way. And I have no idea what I'm going to find, but essentially the question is, what did people know starting in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s about how other places nearby had responded, right? So people often write about Hazleton as if it were not like an hour's drive away from Allentown, where again, like a substantial part of Allentown's recovery is precisely because it garnered these new populations. There's a book from a few years ago called Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown, and it's about essentially social network and social capital theories as applied to Youngstown, Ohio, and Allentown, Pennsylvania, which, the author says these were cities pretty much in the same position, not so different in size, similar industrial background, and Youngstown declined starting in 1950 and just simply never recovered, whereas Allentown actually did manage to find new ways to sustain itself economically, right? So then trying to figure out, okay, so personally, did Lou Barletta know that there was an attempt to create sort of an anti-immigrant backlash in Allentown that was decades long? Ultimately failed, but there's this character named Emma Tropiano who, inside Allentown, if you say Emma, everybody knows who you're talking about. Outside Allentown, if you say Emma Tropiano, everybody but super knowledgeable people will be like, sorry, who's that again? So I'm really curious, as municipal leaders look at other municipal leaders and take their cues from them, exactly how that worked out, because that's going to tell us a lot about exactly how politics develops in the nation's biggest and most important industrial swing state. So that's sort of more a set of questions than a series of findings, but I think these kinds of questions about urban revitalization and metropolitan revitalization driven by immigrants, of course, hook into, all right, how do we find ourselves in the particular place we've been in the past 5 or 15 years? Thanks so much. So now could we both sort of stand up here and...
Yeah, sure. I think we can open it up for questions, complaints.
I'll just speak for 2 minutes. I was at Drexel University, and there was a few years back, and there was a panel discussion on immigration. And it was sponsored by the Yiddish department, which I think has been eliminated, but there were people of all backgrounds, religions, colors on the panel. And this young man got up to speak, and he mentioned the name Orlowitz. And I knew this Orlowitz because he was related to me, and he was related to me, and he had given money to Jefferson University, and his name was on the building, the elder. Now, I said to this young man from the audience, I said, I think we're related. And we were related. We were cousins. And I had never met this young man before. And I connected with him later. Now, he came up with, there were 3 sisters. He came up with family trees of the 3 sisters that were my grandmother and 2 other women. And the granddaughter of another family member, the Liebermans. I'm a Smith because my grandfather was a blacksmith in Latvia, and it comes from the Yiddish Schmidt, the Smith. So I have a cousin of the Lieberman family who is 106 years old. This woman was 106 on Tuesday, October 19th, 2021. I saw her a couple of years ago. Her mind and her physical being was fine, and she's still alive. I want everybody in this room and she was born in 1915. I want everybody in this room to think of themselves as living to 106 or beyond, and just do the math in your head or go home and do the math. So I realize, I imagine if I live to be 106, I'll have 28 more years, and I'm almost 80. So I'm just so thrilled to hear about the immigrants. And I also want to say something about the Native Americans. Too vote, but they never talk about the Native Americans, and I get upset about that. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Actually, I have just to point one thing out there. The way that people often think about immigration is in sort of economically mechanistic terms, like there are poor people elsewhere and they come here. That was much more true, as Domenic pointed out, in the past than in the present, but for the 20th century, in the most busy migration corridor in the world, the US-Mexico border, the number one determinant of whether a person will migrate to the United States has nothing to do with income, has nothing to do with occupation. It's did their father or grandfather work for some time in the United States? So while it might seem sort of random and serendipitous to find family members of yours, it actually may have been that these folks migrated in groups as a family, but then kind of lost track afterwards. So there's actually a historical logic to exactly what you've talked about.
I've worked as an actuary, and we looked at some of our mortality to think about could we group people by zip code. And this whole immigration and revitalization makes me wonder, because I'm a right. If we're looking at it by zip code and the populations are changing, are we capturing that? And I also know that zip code is used for marketing, and with the era of big data, it's used to pump things to folks. In your work, do you run across that intersection between the marketing, the big data, and the demographics? Can you comment on that?
So a little bit. I certainly don't study that type of marketing or big data. One thing I study though is property ownership, and among certain populations, actually, pretty segmented. I mostly study Africans in Philadelphia and people with Asian last names in Chinatown. To try to understand more than just population figures will tell you. And certainly, right, the firms that make money off of big data are trying to mine all sorts of neighborhoods, including new, what they view as new consumers. But it's interesting to me, both doing property ownership studies and studying immigrant community organizations and social networks, that immigrants share many of the same networks that we do, right? Online, right? So many, much of the same sort of data infrastructure, but also build their own online communities. And WhatsApp, right, is arguably the most important sort of social network for most of the immigrant communities that I've studied in Philadelphia. But then there are other ones, right? For people from China, it's WeChat, right? And then and so I think the companies that own those, right, which are the big companies, right? Facebook or whatever it wants to call itself, these days, right? Certainly are mining those networks, but they are not all the same, right? Sort of data banks necessarily, right? Community by community. I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question, but that's some of how I see it.
I think actually, if I could just jump in for one response to that. One of the reasons that Spanish-speaking small businesses were able to survive and thrive at a time when many English-speaking small businesses were getting wiped out is precisely the fact that it took the big box stores 2 or 3 decades to realize the potential of the Latino market. So in the same years when your neighborhood, sporting goods store, hardware store, shoe store, pharmacy was getting wiped out by, Walmart, Walgreens, and the like, the reason that you had sort of multiplying Latino businesses was that the downward predatory pressure that English language megacorporations were putting on English language small storekeepers did not really affect people doing business in Spanish. That was sort of a key to allowing them to get a foothold and achieve the revitalization. Yeah, you go ahead. You kind of know the area better.
Go ahead.
Just looking at the numbers that you were pointing to earlier, the growth of cities in the recent years, and looking at what the last 8 months have done to these. I'm just wondering, since we're not out of this environment, clearly we're all wearing masks, even though we've been vaccinated, right? But it may be too soon to tell what the impact is on the growth of cities. I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, office space, and how cities are populated by suburbanites that commute in. I've been a remote employee for over 10 years. So I'm just, all those are dynamics that affect the city's growth and immigration.
Sure. I do have an answer to that. Generally speaking, now I'm speaking primarily for residential real estate rather than commercial because that's a completely different animal. But there was actually a New York Times spread in 2020 about the whole, our city's doomed now because of the pandemic, because lots of folks were buying properties, moving out because they assumed it was safer out there. And that has completely reversed itself, right? So after all the hue and cry, the city is definitely not emptying out. So that's sort of answer number one. Answer number two is we have a substantial labor shortage in this country. For example, the Wall Street Journal reported a few months ago that we are short about 1 million construction workers. And especially at a time when there's a real scarcity of housing, we need to have those. When there are a lot of job opportunities, people will come and take advantage of them. So we're going to see a large influx of documented or undocumented folks, especially from Mexico and Central America, because they have lots of experience in that industry. So the broader question about what is sort of the future of immigrant-driven urban revitalization, speaking for the Americas, it would be unprecedented, shocking, and totally surprising if we did not see a huge influx of people because we're in desperate need of workers.
And I think, just add a couple of things onto that. While we may see things shake out in different ways in different sectors, right, including those that used to rely heavily on office space downtown, as you point to, right, that's only going to affect a certain segment of the, let's say, demand for new labor. Right? Maybe there are a few janitorial jobs lost and so on, window cleaning, cleaning some offices, etc. But some of the other mega trends, right, in the United States that tell us a lot about why immigrants come here and why the American labor market needs immigrants, especially immigrants who don't make a lot of money. And there's a real slippery slope in what I just said to reinforcing social inequality in the United States. But the demand for care sector jobs, whether that's home health aides or registered nurses or other people taking care of younger and older people, is only going to grow. And that's not just a story about Mexico and Central America. It's also about people coming from the Caribbean, coming from the Philippines, coming from Korea, and we can go on. And so I think there's some particular forces that should make us concerned about particularly certain sectors within U.S. cities. We should be concerned about immigration policies that either do or don't make it easy and legal and safe for people to come here and do all this work that Andrew and I are talking about. Those are things that, I don't think, demography will just take care of, right? Those are really thorny political challenges that we have. But overall, do we, are the forces that have helped, U.S. cities grow continuing? For the most part, I think the big ones are, and do see a whole bunch of, go ahead.
So I've seen some of your slides show buildings that look like they might be approaching the end of their initial service life. They've got new paint, they've got new vinyl signs out front, but it makes me wonder about the condition of the roof and the plumbing and all that. So I'm wondering, have you seen any trend with, is that generation from the 90s that bought that property, is their growth and wealth being invested in the physical condition of the buildings they occupy, or is that building just being allowed to decline further, being resold to the next generation of new arrivals?
I've
think
got
we both
a
have
super
answers. Go
specific
ahead.
example of this one. Generally speaking, from the standpoint of a property owner, the worst possible thing that could happen to your building is if it's unoccupied. Because that means it's not generating any income, and that means that there's nobody around to say, hey, there's a leak that's going to damage the floorboards, right? You get no warning at all there. I can definitely say from the 1950 to 1980 period in a lot of cities, remember that a lot of people who owned property couldn't sell it, couldn't rent it. What did they do? They hired a torch to burn it down and collected the insurance, right? Chicago, you bribe the insurance adjuster so that the company pays. I looked at my neighborhood, South Lawndale, and the next one to the north, North Lawndale, between 1950 and 1980. Now, South Lawndale had seen this huge influx of new people. North Lawndale had lost population. As a result, 10,000 units of housing disappeared in North Lawndale just over those 30 years. 10,000 units in one community area in the city with 77 community areas. In South Lawndale, there was exact parity. There was, some probably were destroyed and others were built, but there was no loss of actual buildings. So one of the key features here, right, is that when immigrants from anywhere come into an area, they revitalize the property market. And that often means, like, the older folks who want to move out of the neighborhood, they got all their equity in that house. If they can't sell it or rent it, they can't get that equity out. So in many cases, these immigrants were financing the ability of people to move to the suburbs, right? So, the question of when does a building reach the end of its useful life, it depends, right? Buildings that are built properly in the 18th or 19th centuries can still be perfectly serviceable. The key is having somebody in there willing to spend the money and the effort to make sure that it's kept up.
But the question was, is the money being spent? Or are these being seen as disposable property where it's just
No.
downcycle food?
No, property ownership, for example, in my two neighborhoods of Little Village and Oak Cliff, the percentage of the percentage of people living in these neighborhoods that own their property are not that different from what they were in 1950, right? So there's this sort of, we can imagine that, cities have become cities of renters, et cetera. At the aggregate level, I don't have any sort of input on that, but in these two neighborhoods and many others like them, the new immigrants own property at about the same rate as the old immigrants. Go to this one next, but you answer first.
It varies by property owner, right? But generally, right, when neighborhoods like the ones that I show on the map in Philadelphia are being repopulated by immigrants in substantial numbers, right? So read most of Northeast Philadelphia, most of South Philadelphia, most of Southwest Philadelphia, but not west side of North Philadelphia, Strawberry Mansion, Hunting Park, not Cedar Brook, if you know that section of what used to be called Mount Airy, not so much in Winfield, part of West Philadelphia, where there are more vacant properties, more properties becoming vacant, more aging population that's not being replaced. Those are the neighborhoods, in Philadelphia where I'm more concerned about the conditions that you're naming and among other related conditions. Where, because in this city, we still have neighborhoods that are losing population, right? It's just in aggregate, and in other neighborhoods, we're gaining. Right? But at the places where there are a lot of immigrants, we're generally gaining, right? And people are absolutely investing in properties in very small and bigger ways. You wanted to go?
Yes, you have a question here? Did you had your hand up? No, not you, the lady behind you.
Sorry, yes, thank you. It's a two-part question. One for both of you. Do you foresee comprehensive immigration reform taking place in the next 10 years? No.
I wish so much that I could say yes, but
If comprehensive immigration reform means a path to citizenship for the vast proportion of the more or less 10.5 or 11 million people we estimate who are in the country right now without legal permission to be here, Sadly, I think it's unlikely. I think the politics of immigration are such that it's going to be hard to see that soon. I think we'll see partial measures, and hopefully one of them is something we've been calling the DREAM Act for a very long time, because I think it's an easier political, win for some people, pill to swallow for others, to say young people are innocent, and if they were brought here, young enough, we can accept them into our society. Their parents are going to be harder for a wider swath of our politicians to accept. I think, sadly, we've seen that over the last 15 years as we've had repeated attempts, right, at comprehensive immigration reform, and it's been done not necessarily by the people we think of as friendlier towards immigration, right? It's the politics of immigration in this country are so strange that I love to confuse my students by saying this, right? Who came closest in the last 21 years in this century? Who came closest to pushing through a really sweeping, comprehensive immigration reform? Who was behind that? Anybody? It was absolutely George W. Bush with Vicente Fox, president from Mexico, who on September 4th, right, 2001, came to Washington to initiate, right, this path to citizenship, really for most people in this country illegally at that time. And then the following week, in a sense, terrorism and national security concerns about immigration nixed that, and we've been fighting about comprehensive immigration reform or something more partial ever since, right? Yeah, that's the you had a second question.
I also,
yeah,
just before you get your follow-up, we'll definitely get the follow-up. I think it's also important to recognize that the situation in Congress is not reflective of public opinion nationally, right? Nationally, like 2/3 to 3/4 of people are perfectly fine with a fairly generous path to citizenship for a huge number of people. But the issue has become politicized in a way that the immigration-friendly Republicans of yore, some of whom just wanted some available affordable labor, and some of whom, like George W. Bush, were trying to make a play for the Latino vote, right? But that brand of Republicanism is dead. And until such time as it comes back, unfortunately, I think, I agree with Domenic that it looks like a very steep climb toward immigration reform. What was your follow-up?
The follow-up is for you, Dr. Samuel-Strauss. It's nuanced with respect to oakcliff. Do you ever consider studying Pleasant Grove?
Sorry, did I ever consider?
Pleasant Grove, the neighborhood of Pleasant Grove.
Basically, there are, again, like Dallas is a city that's 43% Latino, mostly Mexican American. There are different stories in each one, and you have some sort of very xenophobic suburbs, right? I think the other thing to mention is that anti-immigrant politics are focused especially in places where there are not that many immigrants, right? Like everywhere where there, because again, this is sort of one of those political legends that, there was just sort of a blue-collar backlash by people who were in competition with these low-wage immigrants. Now, that is certainly imaginable, right? That you can't look at that and say, like, though that would never happen. It certainly could, and it has in the past. But currently, the most immigrant-friendly jurisdictions are those with lots of immigrants already. And the folks most in competition with new immigrants are the immigrants from 15 or 20 years ago from the same places, basically. So, again, it's, one of the leading tragedies of the current era that we desperately need immigrants economically, culturally, demographically, at the same time where we have this political movement that makes that hard.
Do you want us to?
Yeah.
One more question.
You get to.
I saw another hand up.
In your first slide, you had a picture of lines of how people had left the city. And I wondered what is bringing them back. Why do you think they left? In other words,
So we're talking about.
I think my first slide of Philadelphia population.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can tell you what
Go ahead.
put it this way, and this is economists, so they measure somewhat different things in somewhat different ways. Through surveys and other methods, what they have found is that people want to be in cities for the cultural amenities and the restaurants and the clubs and whatnot, and the museums, etc. They are less afraid of crime because it dropped sharply after 1991. So it seems to be the reason why doctors and business people and lawyers and folks with some disposable income who would have been perfectly happy to stay living in Allentown or Harrisburg, why they all want to live in Philadelphia now or in New York, why they don't want to live in Poughkeepsie or Schenectady, but want to live in the city, is just the availability of those like absolutely first-rate cultural, culinary amenities. And as Domenic already pointed out, those are amenities that are completely dependent upon immigrant labor. So, something to keep in mind.
Thank you. And of course, one of those amenities would be the Athenaeum.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And Domenic, I particularly like the concept you mentioned of extended youth, which is what we aim for here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. That was
Thank you all for coming.
stimulating, terrific, wonderful. Thank you. Let me just very quickly tell you about a couple of upcoming events here at the Athenaeum. On January 4th, this is an in-person event, Gordon Fraser will be here talking about his book, Star Territory, the Universe, the concept of the universe in 19th century America. A virtual event on January 10th, Yara, I'm going to have trouble with this, Zagib, will talk to us about her new novel, No Land to Light On, which is the story of a young Syrian couple thrown apart by a travel ban. And we're also beginning a new book club, the founding of the ERA Book Club, with University of Maryland professor Richard Bell, who is just terrific. He's done courses for us before, and he's just marvelous. Our spring brochure of events is at the printers as we speak. It should be arriving in your mail slots very soon. So again, thank you all for being here, and Domenic and Andrew, thank you for a really wonderful presentation.